The oven heat slapped my face like a physical insult. I ignored the sting because my sister's voice was sharper than any blade. "You're just a chef!" my sister screamed, tears streaming. I stood there, covered in burns, smiling through tears. Her billionaire fiancé, Julian, walked past her and went straight to me. "I've been trying to meet you for 6 months," he said. My family went pale. The gilded kitchen fell silent. Only the hum of the industrial refrigerator remained as a witness to their sudden, chilling terror. Julian reached out and gently gripped my scarred forearm. He did not look at Chloe. He did not acknowledge my parents standing by the marble island. His eyes were fixed on my white apron, now stained with charcoal and sweat. My mother clutched her pearls so hard the string looked ready to snap. She had spent years telling me I was the family's greatest disappointment. Now, the most powerful man in the city was holding my hand like it was a holy relic. The air in the room grew heavy. My father tried to step forward, his face a mask of practiced charm. He opened his mouth to explain away my presence as if I were hired help. Julian held up a single hand, silencing the room instantly. "I sent 5 emails to your personal domain, Liam," Julian said softly. I narrowed my eyes. I had never received a single message from the Vane group. I looked at my father. His tan skin turned a sickly shade of gray. He had been my gatekeeper for 5 long years. The realization settled in my chest like lead. My father had not just mocked my career. He had actively sabotaged it to keep me serving them. He needed my secret checks to pay for the brownstone. He needed my labor to keep Chloe in designer silk. I looked at the tray of delicate pastries I had just finished. They were masterpieces born from agony. I realized then that I was the only thing holding their crumbling world together. Without my silent sacrifice, they had absolutely nothing to offer the world. "I didn't get the emails, Julian," I said, my voice steady for the first time in a decade. I reached behind my neck and untied the strings of my apron. The heavy fabric slid down my body and pooled at my feet. Chloe let out a small, jagged sob of frustration. She looked at Julian, desperate for a gaze that would never return to her. I pulled my personal phone from my pocket. With 3 deliberate taps, I canceled the recurring wire transfers to my parents' bank account. The color drained completely from my mother's lips as her phone chimed with a notification. She knew that sound. It was the sound of a safety net snapping. Julian watched me with a knowing, predatory smile. He didn't care about the wedding or the family image. He wanted the talent that built the empire. I walked past my father without a word. I headed for the back door, leaving the smell of burnt sugar and betrayal behind. Outside, the cold air finally tasted like the truth. Julian walked with me toward the gravel parking lot. The cold air stung the fresh burns on my arms. Behind us, the brownstone glowed with expensive lights that my sweat had paid for. Julian stopped by a sleek black sedan. He didn't look back at the house once. "Your father is a very thorough man," he said quietly. He pulled a thick folder from the back seat. It was filled with my own signature. Someone had been forging my name for months. The documents were partnership agreements for a new venture in London. I scanned the pages with shaking hands. My father had signed off on a massive buyout of my bakery. He had tried to sell my life's work while I was busy baking for his parties. The betrayal felt like a heavy weight in my lungs. He didn't just want my money. He wanted to own my future. I looked at Julian. The billionaire wasn't smiling anymore. He looked dangerous. "He told me you were too sick to travel," Julian explained. I touched the bandages on my wrists. The lie was so calculated it made me feel nauseous. My family had crafted a narrative of my failure to keep me trapped. Every time I reached for more, they pulled the leash tighter. I realized I was never a son to them. I was a high-yield asset to be managed. Julian leaned against the car door. He was waiting for my move. I pulled out my phone and dialed the bank manager. It was late, but I had the private number for a reason. "This is Liam. Freeze all commercial accounts for the Gilded Crumb immediately," I said. My voice didn't tremble. I could hear the party noise muffled through the thick walls of the house. They were probably drinking champagne I had bought yesterday. The manager confirmed the freeze. The flow of oxygen to the house was officially cut off. A shadow moved by the side entrance. It was Chloe, clutching her cashmere wrap as if it could protect her from the truth. She looked small without her ring and her followers. "Liam, please don't do this," she whispered. Her eyes were red from crying. She wasn't sorry for the abuse. She was only terrified of the silence. She saw the folder in my hand and gasped. She knew about the London deal. She had been part of the plan. Julian stepped between us, shielding me from her gaze. "The engagement is over, Chloe. I don't partner with thieves," he said. His voice was like a guillotine. Chloe flinched as if he had struck her. She looked at me, hoping for the usual forgiveness I always offered. I stayed silent. I watched a single tear roll down her cheek. It didn't move me. I saw the greed hidden behind her grief. She wasn't losing a brother. She was losing a lifestyle. I handed the folder back to Julian. "I'll see you in London, but on my terms," I said. He nodded once. A silent pact formed between us. I turned my back on the brownstone and started walking toward the street. My car was a beat-up van, but it was mine. As I reached the driver's side, my phone buzzed with an urgent alert. My father had just tried to bypass the bank freeze. He was using my mother's secret offshore account. I sat in my van and watched the dashboard light flicker. The notification about my mother's offshore account blinked like a warning. I knew that money was meant for my inheritance. Instead, they were using it as a weapon against my escape. I gripped the steering wheel until the burns on my palms throbbed. I had to reach the main server at the bakery. That was the only place to lock them out for good. The engine roared to life. Rain began to smear the windshield as I drove toward the city. My mind raced through the digital codes I had set up years ago. My father was desperate and clever. He would try to drain every cent before the sun rose. I passed the glowing signs of the financial district. Everything felt hollow now. The prestige of the family name was just a thin veil for theft. I checked my rearview mirror. A set of headlights followed me closely. The bakery was dark when I arrived at the rear entrance. My hands shook as I fumbled with the heavy brass keys. I stepped into the kitchen and smelled the lingering scent of yeast and flour. It usually brought me peace, but tonight it felt like a cage. I headed straight for the small office in the back. The computer screen cast a blue glow over the flour-dusted desk. I logged in and saw the transfer pending. I hit the override key just as the office door creaked open. I expected my father, but it was Marcus, my head baker. He looked pale and held a manila envelope. "They came here an hour ago, Liam," he whispered. He handed me the papers. My parents had already filed an emergency injunction to seize the business. They claimed I was mentally unfit to manage the estate. They were trying to strip me of my very identity. I read the legal jargon with a cold, sharpening focus. They had used my medical records from the time I was burned last year. They twisted a workplace accident into a sign of instability. It was a perfect, surgical strike against my autonomy. Marcus watched me with eyes full of pity. I didn't want his sympathy. I wanted my life back. I turned back to the screen and began a counter protocol. I had one card left to play. The headlights I saw earlier finally pulled into the alleyway. Julian stepped out of the black sedan and walked into the kitchen. He didn't look surprised to see Marcus or the legal papers. He looked at the computer screen and nodded. "I have my lawyers on standby, but you need to see this first," he said. He handed me a tablet. It showed a live feed of my father speaking to a rival hospitality group he was selling. My father was auctioning off my recipes and my brand in real time. He was acting like a man who already owned the prize. I felt a strange calm wash over me. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold and absolute resolve. I looked at Julian and then back at the blinking cursor on the screen. "Let him sell it," I said quietly. Julian raised an eyebrow. I clicked a final button. I had just deleted the master files. The screen flickered as the master recipe files vanished into nothingness. Julian leaned over my shoulder, his shadow stretching across the flour-dusted desk. "You just wiped out 5 years of work," he noted. I stood up and felt the weight of the deletion in my chest. My father's auction was now selling an empty shell. Without my proprietary yeast ratios and hydration secrets, the brand was worthless. I checked my watch. The buyers would realize the truth in minutes. Julian's phone buzzed on the desk. He didn't answer it. Instead, he watched me with an intensity that made the room feel small. "Your father just called my associate. He is panicking because the server went dark," Julian said. I felt a grim satisfaction bloom behind my ribs. The man who called me a peasant was finally realizing who held the power. But the victory felt hollow. I was still standing in a basement while they owned my name. The back door slammed open. echoing through the empty kitchen. My father stormed in, his expensive silk tie loosened and hanging limp. He looked older, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "What have you done, Liam?" he roared. He didn't see Julian at first. He only saw his son, the worker who had finally stopped working. He lunged toward the computer, but I didn't move. I let him see the blank screen. My father hit the keyboard in a desperate frenzy. "The backup, where is the physical backup?" he screamed. I pointed to the industrial shredder in the corner. The metal teeth were still humming. He stopped, his shoulders sagging as the reality of the loss sank in. He had promised those recipes to men who didn't accept failure. His reputation was his only currency. Now, he was bankrupt in every way that mattered. The silence in the bakery was deafening. Julian finally stepped out of the shadows. My father froze, his eyes darting between the billionaire and the shredder. "Mr. Reed, there has been a technical glitch," my father stammered. Julian didn't offer a polite smile this time. He looked at the burns on my arms and then at the man who caused them. "There is no glitch, Brian. There is only a consequence," Julian said. He pulled a thin, blue document from his inner pocket. It was a personal debt purchase agreement. Julian had bought my father's gambling markers from a casino in Macau. My father's knees buckled, and he grabbed the edge of the prep table for support. "I was going to pay it back with the London deal," he whispered. Julian shook his head slowly. The power had shifted entirely. I wasn't just a chef anymore. I was the only person in the room with a clean slate. I walked toward the door, leaving the two men to negotiate over the remains of a legacy. I needed to see Chloe one last time. She was the one who had truly broken the bond. As I stepped into the alley, a black SUV blocked my path. The window rolled down, revealing my mother's pale, frantic face. She wasn't looking for forgiveness. She held a heavy, antique jewelry box in her lap. "Take this and leave, Lamb," she pleaded. I stared at the velvet jewelry box in my mother's lap. The emeralds inside were family heirlooms, supposedly lost during the Great Depression. It was another lie in a lifetime of carefully constructed deceptions. "Take this and leave, Liam," she pleaded, her voice trembling. She wasn't trying to help me. She was trying to buy my silence before Julian's lawyers tore the family tree apart. I pushed the box back into the dark cabin of the SUV. The gems felt like cold, dead weight. The driver accelerated, leaving me standing in the rain. I turned back toward the bakery, but a new sound stopped me. It was the rhythmic thud of a heavy boots on the pavement. Two men in dark suits stepped out from behind the dumpster. They weren't Julian's people. Their presence felt clinical and dangerous. One of them held a digital tablet displaying a map of my proprietary server. They were the buyers from the rival group. They wanted what I had just deleted. "We know you wiped the drive, Liam," the taller man said. His voice was flat and devoid of emotion. He didn't care about my family drama or my sister's engagement. He only cared about the data. I realized my father had taken a massive deposit from these people. They weren't just angry, they were invested. My heart hammered against my ribs as they closed the distance. I backed toward the metal door, but it was already locked from the inside. Julian stepped out of the bakery just as the men reached for my collar. He didn't look panicked. He looked like a man who had predicted every move on the board. "The debt is settled, gentlemen," Julian said. He held up his phone, showing a confirmation of a wire transfer. The men paused, their eyes flicking between the billionaire and me. They weren't looking for a fight if the money was right. They took one final look at me and vanished into the shadows. I leaned against the brick wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The adrenaline was fading, leaving me hollow and exhausted. Julian walked over and handed me a clean handkerchief. "They were never going to hurt you, Liam. They just needed to see you wouldn't break," he said. I wiped the soot from my face and looked at him. I realized then that Julian hadn't just saved me. He had orchestrated the entire confrontation to test my resolve. I felt a sudden, sharp surge of anger. I wasn't a pawn for my father, and I wasn't a project for a billionaire. I threw the handkerchief onto the wet pavement. "You knew they were coming," I said. Julian didn't deny it. He simply adjusted his cufflinks and looked toward the city skyline. He wanted a partner who could survive the pressure of a global empire. I was the chef, but he was the architect of my survival. He held out a key. The key was made of heavy, brushed steel with a Tokyo address engraved on the side. It was the flagship location I had dreamed of for a decade. But as I reached for it, my phone buzzed with one final message from Chloe. It wasn't a plea for money or a scream of rage. It was a photograph of a hidden ledger tucked inside my father's desk. The dates went back 20 years. I wasn't the first son they had tried to break. I stared at the image on my phone screen. The ledger showed names of people I didn't recognize. There were dates, amounts, and cold notations about liquidated assets, next to family members. I had an older brother I never knew existed. He hadn't died in a car accident like they told me. He had been sold out just like I was. Julian watched me as my world shifted once more. The rain turned into a heavy, freezing sleet that rattled against the bakery's metal door. The objective was now clear in my mind. I had to find the physical ledger before my father destroyed it. It was the only proof of 20 years of systematic human exploitation. I turned away from Julian and his steel key. "I'm going back to the house," I said. My voice was a flat, dangerous whisper. Julian didn't try to stop me this time. He simply stepped aside and watched. He knew the hunter had finally found his true scent. The drive back to the brownstone felt like a descent into a tomb. I ignored the throbbing pain in my burned forearms. I parked the van on the sidewalk and stormed through the front door. The party guests were gone, leaving only half-empty glasses and the smell of stale perfume. My mother was sitting on the stairs, clutching her jewelry box. She looked up at me with hollow, terrified eyes. She knew why I was back. The silence in the foyer was absolute. I marched past her toward my father's private study. The door was locked, but I didn't reach for a key. I used my shoulder and the weight of my rage to force it open. The wood splintered with a satisfying crack. My father was standing by the fireplace, clutching a stack of leather-bound books. He looked like a cornered animal. A small fire was already licking at the edges of the grate. He was burning the evidence of his greatest sins. I lunged forward and grabbed his wrists before he could drop the books. He was surprisingly weak. The man who had loomed over my life was just a frail, desperate thief. "Where is he, Dad?" I demanded. He didn't answer. He just looked at the flames with a vacant stare. I wrestled the ledger from his grip and threw it onto the rug. He collapsed into his leather chair, weeping without any sound. It was the most pathetic thing I had ever seen. I opened the book to the final page. Chloe's name was there, but it wasn't as a beneficiary. She was listed as a collateral interest for the debt to the Macau casino. My father had intended to sell her lifestyle to Julian to wipe his own slate. My sister wasn't just a spoiled brat. She was a product he was trying to move. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of pity for her. We were both just cattle in his eyes. A floorboard creaked behind me in the dim light. I turned to see Chloe standing in the doorway. She was still wearing her cream cashmere, but it was stained with spilled wine. She had heard everything. Her face was a mask of porcelain that had finally shattered. She looked at the ledger on the floor and then at our father. The realization of her true value hit her like a physical blow. She didn't scream. She just stared at the fire. I picked up the ledger and tucked it under my arm. My objective was complete, but the victory felt like ash in my mouth. I walked over to Chloe and put a hand on her shoulder. She flinched at first, then leaned into me. For the first time in our lives, we were on the same side of the glass. "We're leaving," I said. She nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving the man in the chair. He was dead to us now. We walked out of the study and into the cold hallway. My mother was still on the stairs, a ghost in her own home. She didn't look up as we passed. I felt the weight of the steel key in my pocket. It was the key to a future that didn't include them. As we reached the front door, Julian was waiting in the rain. He looked at the ledger and then at Chloe. He offered her his coat. It was a gesture of respect. We stepped out into the night, leaving the brownstone behind forever. I felt the first real breath of freedom in my lungs. But as I opened the van door for Chloe, my phone buzzed again. It was an anonymous alert from the bank. Someone had just accessed my commercial server, using my own biometric signature. I looked at Julian, but he was already looking at the house. A light had just turned on in the basement. My bakery was being purged. I sprinted toward the van, pulling Chloe behind me. The alert on my phone screen was a jagged red line across my dignity. Someone was in my bakery using my bio signature. I knew I hadn't left my physical sensors active, but I had forgotten the legacy scanner hidden in the flour silo. Julian followed us in his sedan, his tires screaming against the wet asphalt. We tore through the city streets. I felt the heat of the fire starting in my mind. The betrayal was deepening. We reached the bakery and I saw the lights flickering in the basement. I didn't wait for Julian to catch up. I kicked the rear door open and charged into the heat. The smell was wrong. It wasn't the scent of sourdough or sweet cream. It was the chemical tang of melting plastic and ozone. I reached the office and froze. Marcus was standing there, his hand hovering over the override console. He looked up at me with a face full of absolute regret. "They have my daughter, Liam," Marcus whispered. He wasn't a traitor by choice. My father had reached out and found the only leverage that mattered. Marcus had used a high-resolution digital copy of my thumbprint to bypass the final encryption. He had been forced to restore the very files I had deleted. The rival group was already downloading the recipe secrets. I looked at the progress bar on the wall monitor. It was at 90%. My life's work was bleeding out into the dark. I didn't blame Marcus. I looked at the wires snaking into the wall. Julian entered the room, his eyes scanning the technical setup with cold precision. "Stop the transfer, Liam," he commanded. I shook my head. If I stopped it now, Marcus's daughter would pay the price. My father knew I was soft for my people. He had banked on my empathy to secure his final payday. I had to choose between my legacy and a child's life. The choice was easy. I stepped away from the console and let the bar reach 95%. Chloe stood in the doorway, her hands over her mouth. She was watching the destruction of the brother she had finally started to respect. Julian grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "You are giving them the keys to the kingdom," he hissed. I looked him in the eye. I wasn't the man they thought I was. I had one more trick hidden in the code of the Dove. I reached out and typed a single command into the secondary terminal. It wasn't an abort sequence. It was a catalyst. I had embedded a logic bomb in the master yeast formulas years ago. If the files were accessed without the physical salt key in my pocket, the data would corrupt. The recipes would look perfect, but the chemistry was flawed. Every loaf would fail. Every cake would collapse. The buyers would have nothing but a series of expensive, useless errors. The bar hit 100. The transfer was complete. The rival group now owned a digital ghost. Marcus slumped against the desk, a sob escaping his throat. His phone buzzed with a message. His daughter had been dropped off at his mother's house. The pressure in the room vanished, replaced by a heavy, hollow silence. I looked at the blackened server. It was over. The gilded crumb was dead. I felt a strange sense of peace. I was no longer a chef or a victim. Julian let go of my arm. He looked at the terminal and then at me. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. He wasn't angry about the lost data. He was impressed by the scorched earth policy. "You destroyed the prize to save the man," Julian said. He took the steel key for Tokyo out of his pocket and placed it in my hand. "That is why you are my partner." I gripped the metal. It felt cold and very real. Chloe walked over and took Marcus's hand. She was finally acting like a human being instead of an influencer. We stood in the ruins of my first dream. The convection ovens were cold. The flour dust was settled. I looked at the burns on my arms one last time. They were the price of admission to a life I actually wanted. I turned toward the exit, ready to leave this basement forever. But the door wouldn't open. The electronic lock was dead. Smoke began to curl from the ceiling vents. My father hadn't just wanted the data. He wanted to erase the evidence of his theft. He had rigged the bakery to burn once the transfer finished. The chemical smell intensified, stinging my eyes and lungs. We were trapped in a steel box with a rising fire. I looked at the heavy industrial mixing bowl. It was the only thing solid enough to break the door. I grabbed the rim and swung with everything I had left. Julian grabbed a fire extinguisher while I swung the steel bowl against the locked door. The metal groaned but held firm. Chloe coughed, her face pale against the soot-stained wall. We were running out of breathable air. I looked at the industrial ovens. If the gas lines ignited, the entire block would vanish. My father's final act was a total erasure. I threw my weight into the final strike. The electronic lock sparked and the door hissed open. We stumbled into the freezing alley, gasping for the winter air. Fire trucks screamed in the distance, their sirens a funeral dirge for my past. I looked back at the gilded crumb as flames licked the window glass. Everything I had built was melting into a river of sugar and ash. Julian stood beside me, his eyes reflecting the orange glow. He looked calm. "He won't stop until we are all gone," Chloe whispered. She watched the smoke rise, her hand clutching my scorched sleeve. I realized then that the ledger in my van was not just proof. It was a death warrant for my father's reputation. He was willing to burn his own children to hide his history. Julian pulled his phone out and made a single, quiet call. Within seconds, every news outlet in the city received the ledger's digital scan. The power had shifted for the final time. My father's face appeared on the news feeds as the police arrived at the brownstone. The Boston old money, Facade, was officially dead. Chloe looked at me and finally smiled through the grime. She didn't need the influencer likes anymore. She had the truth. Julian opened the car door, signaling the end of the night. We were alive and the debt was finally settled. I felt a strange, heavy peace. 1 year later, the Tokyo sun warmed my new kitchen. The glass walls offered a view of a city that respected my craft. Julian stood by the ribbon waiting for the first guest to arrive. I looked at my hands. The old burned scars had faded into thin white lines. They were no longer wounds. They were the foundation of my success. Marcus moved efficiently through the prep station, his daughter safe and happy. I was finally the owner. I took a bite of a fresh croissant. It tasted like butter, salt, and absolute freedom. I had stopped feeding people who wanted me to starve. My family was a distant memory, a ghost story I no longer told. I looked at the steel key on my necklace. It was the only heirloom I cared to keep. The bakery doors opened and the crowd rushed in. I didn't see customers. I saw a world I had built myself. Then, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number in London. My older brother was finally reaching out.